Hey, it's Ryan Gillard here at Real Broker, your Calgary realtor. And in this video, I'm in Northeast Calgary. If you follow my channel, I haven't done too many videos on the Northeast. It has a bit of a stigma to it, and I can't tell you how many times a buyer has told me, I want to buy a property in Calgary for $500,000, but I don't want to live in the Northeast. Now, is it that bad? Is it a good place to live? In this video, I'll let you know all the pros and cons of living in Northeast Calgary and answer the question, is Northeast Calgary a good place to live? Let's get into it.
And first things first, I'm going to show you on the map the area that I'm referring to. Now, it might sound obvious talking about Northeast Calgary, which would be over here, obviously, but there are some things to point out. Now, when people say they don't want to live in the Northeast, they're generally referring to this area over here for the most part, but there are areas of the Northeast with the Northeast mailing address that are quite nice, like areas like Bridgeland, very popular neighborhood, Renfrew, Winston Heights. Basically, all this area over here is still technically northeast. Everything east of Center Street, which is this road right here, is northeast. And another thing to point out is some of the areas that have a real stigma to them, like the Erin Woods, Forest Lawn, Pembroke. This area over here is technically a southeast neighborhood, has a southeast mailing address. So everything south of Memorial Drive that you see right here is the dividing line between northeast over here and southeast right here. But people lump this area into the Northeast, even though it has the Southeast mailing address. And some of these areas are the most stigmatized, I would say, in all of Calgary. So I'm going to lump these areas into the Northeast. And the area that I'm covering in this video is basically all of this chunk right over here, from, say, Forest Lawn down here all the way up to Skyview Ranch. So this is the area that I'm covering in this video. And you can actually see, if you look at the Krebs community map, so all this northeast section right here, and parts of this green section. And it gets pretty industrial into this section over here, not so much residential. So this section right over here, and the pink section. And if you're curious about these areas, I have a video specifically on I have a video specifically on the inner city of Calgary, where I touch on many of these inner city northeast neighborhoods as well. And in a future video, I will cover this kind of teal-looking area in north central Calgary, which has parts of northeast and northwest. So that'll be a future video at some point.
Now, this part of Calgary definitely has some stereotypes and some stigma attached to it, some warranted, some isn't. But I want to give you a bit about my backstory, just because I'm very familiar with the Northeast. So I was born and raised in Alberta. We moved from Lethbridge to Calgary when I was very young, I think earlier than kindergarten. So call it kindergarten to grade 6, we lived in Calgary. My dad lived in the northeast neighborhood of Rundle. So as a kid, we spent a lot of time in Rundle. Grade 6 to grade 12, we moved to Strathmore. Now, back in the 90s, to do anything if you lived in Strathmore, you had to come to Calgary. So we'd take the Trans-Canada Highway West into northeast Calgary, and spent a lot of time there in the 90s in the northeast. And then when I finished high school in 2000, me and a bunch of friends, we all moved out from Strathmore and moved into the neighborhood of Rundle, into the townhouses right across the street from the Sunridge Mall. And we saw a lot of stuff, which I'll touch on later. And fast forward to, say, I think it was 2010 to 2012, I sold cars at Eastside Dodge, and I lived in the neighborhood of Pine Ridge in the Northeast. So I'm very familiar with the Northeast. And since 2012, I've been a realtor here in Calgary, and I spent a lot of time in the Northeast selling properties. So you're getting the opinion of someone who's actually spent a lot of time in the Northeast part of Calgary.
And point number one, and the most obvious benefit to living in Northeast Calgary, is just the real estate prices are way more affordable compared to other parts of the city. So here's a regional breakdown. You can see on the west side, the average price is $727, but in the northeast, it's $527, and the east district is $441. And again, the east district is this green area. I'm covering this chunk of the green area as part of the northeast, and it's just way cheaper. So I'll go through the market stats for you, and I'll just briefly, I don't want to get too in-depth with them, but you can see here the average price up 15.9% year over year to $527,000. That is the average of all of these product types. So detached homes, duplexes, row houses, aka townhouses, and your classic apartment-style condos. So for detached homes, the average price $609,600. Now that sounds expensive, but there are parts of the deep Northeast which have brand new homes which are fairly pricey. But there are definitely pockets of the Northeast that you can find homes, I don't know, 400s, 500s still. So for duplexes, average price $441,100, up 18.4% year over year. huge increases. Look at apartments, 310,600, up 30% year over year. And townhouses are up 29.5% to 382,300. Only 1.32 months of supply, which is a hardcore seller's market. This means that if we can't list new properties, it will only take 1.32 months to sell all of the homes in Northeast Calgary. So our market is still favoring the seller. It's on fire at the moment. And I'll just skip down to the bottom here and give you the benchmark property. So the benchmark, the real estate board figures it out where it's like the most common type of property in the area. It's kind of like the average, but a bit more sophisticated, I guess. So lots of one-story bungalows in the Northeast. A huge chunk of this area has homes from like the late 70s to the 80s. So a lot of bungalows, and the average bungalow you see here is 1,145 square feet, 3 bedrooms upstairs, built in 1978, 2 beds, 2 baths, finished basement, and the benchmark price is $565,000. So there's tons of these properties in the Northeast, which are great for renting out. This is the part of Calgary that has a lot of basement suites, and bungalows with the back entrance are fantastic if you want to suite something out and rent it. And as you get into the newer parts of the Northeast, it becomes more of like your 2-story properties. So these are about 1,433 square feet, 3 bedrooms with a 2,000, 1 bedroom downstairs, 2 full bathrooms, 1 half bathroom, and I can't read if it's totally or partially finished basement. And the benchmark price is $641. So the 2 stories are generally newer and more expensive than the bungalows. Now, if we look at duplexes, 1,088 square feet, 3 bedrooms up, 1 down, built in 1979, 3 full, 2.5 bathrooms, and the benchmark price is $441. Townhouses, slightly less, so 1,114 square feet, 3 bedrooms, built in 1990. So the townhouses are generally newer than the duplexes, with 1.5 bathrooms, average price $382,300. And lastly, the apartments. So these are newer, 866 square feet on average, 2 bedrooms, built in 2013, 2 bathrooms, and the benchmark price is $310,600. So you can see here the property values are just, they're more attainable for the most part. And Calgary, the minimum wage is pretty high. Our incomes are high in Calgary. If you have a working couple, I think it's fairly attainable to afford a property like this in Northeast Calgary.
And the next major pro about the Northeast, and one that doesn't get enough credit for, and I think that's the Northeast part of Calgary, it supports a lot of the businesses in the city. So once you leave the downtown, the next area that has the most office space is the Northeast. Lots of warehouses, industrial land, lots of low-rise office buildings, some high-rise office buildings. So there's just all sorts of things going on in the Northeast. And if you don't want to commute forever going to work, the Northeast can be a very convenient part of Calgary to live in.
And speaking of convenience, I should bring up the Ctrain. Now, I'm using a different realtor's map here just because I like the overlay that they have here, Marnie Campbell. She's a realtor here in Calgary. You can see here's the downtown, and the blue line, I believe it's the blue line, runs from downtown all the way up into the deeper parts of the Northeast. This is already built. You can see here Marlborough, Rundle, Whitehorn, all the way to Saddle Ridge. So it's quite convenient, and to actually get from areas like, say, Monterey Park or Temple to the Ctrain stop, lots of park and ride in this part of town, so it's quite easy to get to the Ctrain and park your car there or take a connecting bus to the line. And it's not that long of a commute to the downtown. I would say from downtown to the Northeast, like areas like Rundle, Marlborough, I'd say it's 10, 15 minutes on the Ctrain. It's not that long of a ride. And there are plans to develop the Ctrain further. Here's the plan right here. So right now it ends at Saddletown, and they're talking about building one to 88th Avenue, and then in the future it'll go from 88th Avenue to the airport at some point. Now, I don't know why they haven't done this yet. It seems like a fantastic idea, but at some point the Ctrain will go to the airport.
The next major benefit is how easy it is to access the airport from most parts of the Northeast. I would say on average it might take about 10 to 15 minutes from most neighborhoods to get to the airport, so quite convenient. And in the deeper eastern parts of the area, there's a new airport tunnel which goes underneath one of the runways, so it's even easier to access the airport. And in the future, again, there should be a Ctrain stop coming at some point. So it's just very convenient. If you are someone that frequents the airport quite often, you might want to consider the Northeast. And the one drawback, though, depending on how close you are to the airport, you could be right in the flight path and you will get a lot of noise from the planes. I was just golfing at Wingfield about 2 weeks back, and I was shocked that every 5 minutes there's a giant plane landing, and you can even smell the fumes. So it can be quite loud depending on how close you're living to the airport. But again, it is convenient at the same time. And the next point, and one that I think the Northeast doesn't get enough credit for, is just super convenient. I've already talked about the Ctrain line. I've talked about the airport, the business district with all the low-rise office buildings, the warehouses, the easy access to downtown. But it also has some of the best shopping in the entire city. I think it's probably the most convenient shopping area of all of Calgary. There's every big box chain store known to man can be found in the Northeast. They're easy to access. The Northeast is completely flat, so it's easy to drive around. Lots of connecting roads. You got the Deerfoot Trail, you've got the Stony Trail, you've got 32nd Avenue, McKnight Boulevard, International Avenue, Barlow Trail, Memorial Drive. It's just super easy to get around. Again, there's excellent shopping. You've got Marlborough Mall. Now, that said, Marlborough Mall is the worst mall in Calgary by far, without question. You've got Sunridge Mall as well, just down the road, which is a bit more modern and upgraded compared to Marlborough Mall. So you've got excellent shopping, easy to get around, excellent infrastructure. It's just the most convenient location in all of Calgary. And the last point is the Peter Lougheed Hospital is located just north of Sunridge Mall, so it's kind of like in the Rundle-Whitehorn area, and it has its a Ctrain stop as well, so it's very easy to access the hospital as well. And the next point, you can't really talk about Northeast Calgary without talking about cultural diversity. This really is the most melting pot part of Calgary. It's kind of like how Surrey is to Vancouver. It's just extremely diverse. You'll see everything here. You'll see white people, Africans, Filipinos, Indians, Chinese, everything basically. And driving around, you'll see all sorts of different like Indian schools, Muslim schools, and for cuisine options, if you're on International Avenue, you'll see like a Vietnamese restaurant next to a Moroccan restaurant. Next to a Yemenis restaurant. So it's just extremely diverse. So it's an extremely diverse part of Calgary. And if you are a foodie, there are some great options here if you know where to look. And I just don't think it gets enough credit for what it is. And next up, let's talk about some of the negative aspects of living in Northeast Calgary. So what I did is I asked ChatGPT to list off the top 20 negative things specifically about living in Northeast Calgary. So here's the list right here. I'm going to go through them and let you know my thoughts on each point here. So the first point is the crime rates in Northeast Calgary are higher than anywhere else in Calgary. That is 100% true, but that doesn't mean that Northeast Calgary is a dangerous place to live. I'll go anywhere in Calgary at any time, and I never worry about crime. But things have happened to be in the Northeast, so a few things. So put my list down here. So I've had my car smashed on Rundle-Horn Drive by a hit-and-run driver. He's probably drunk, and the cops couldn't find him, and my insurance wouldn't cover the damage. So that happened right in the Pine Ridge neighborhood, and I doubt that would have happened if you were somewhere else like Brentwood or Springbank Hill, but that happens all the time in Northeast Calgary, like petty stuff like that. I've also seen people tased on the Ctrain tracks in Marlborough, quite often actually. When I worked at Eastside Dodge, it was directly across the tracks from the Marlborough station. So that was quite often we saw stuff like that, people getting arrested on the Ctrain. Someone actually broke into our car dealership. They stole the car, they drove it through the mechanic bay doors, and we found it the next day in BC. So stuff like that happens, like petty theft. I've had friends who got into fights in Rundle when I lived in the townhouses with a bunch of friends. So stuff like that. We're always joking around that the cop helicopter was always kind of circling our neighborhood. So there's definitely more crime in the Northeast compared to anywhere else in Calgary, but it's not a dangerous place to live. Like in terms of crime, maybe the west side of Calgary is like a 1, and maybe Northeast Calgary is like a 3. So we're talking about Canada still. It's a very safe place to live, and Calgary is one of the richest cities in Canada. So I don't really worry about crime in Calgary, but if there is a crime, it's more likely to happen in the Northeast than anywhere else in the city. And in terms of crime, if you were to poll most Calgarians, what is the worst neighborhood in the city, you would get answers like Forest Lawn, Erin Woods, Pembroke, Dover, stuff like that would be quite common answers. And the video that I have playing in the background is actually a forest lawn. So as you can see, it's not that bad. Calgary is a very safe city, and even the neighborhoods with the most stigma, like Forest Lawn, are actually totally fine to drive through and walk around in. So Calgary is just a very safe city. So number 2, I've got my notes here. So number 2 is traffic congestion. Now, I don't know if I agree with this. The best traffic in Calgary is in the northwest, easiest to get around, and the worst would be in the south part of the city. But northeast, I'd say, is in the middle of the pack. It's not terrible in terms of traffic. There are a few spots that are annoying, like say Deerfoot northbound trying to connect onto McKnight Boulevard is a bit of a pain in the ass. But right now it's under construction, and hopefully it's fixed in the near future. That's like a spot that's always kind of backed up. And I would also say that 36th Street Northeast, where the Ctrain line is, that can be backed up at times as well. But overall, the Northeast is not too bad in terms of traffic. And point number 3, they have it as limited public transportation. Now, I don't agree with this at all. The Ctrain line runs right through Northeast Calgary, and there are plans to expand it, like I mentioned earlier in this video. So for that, I don't agree, and it's actually quite easy to drive around the Northeast. So I think ChatGPT is wrong on this one. Point number 4 is noise pollution. I do agree with this. If you are near the airport, you will hear the planes landing, and you can even smell the fumes sometime if you're close enough. So there is some noise with the airport, and for that point, I would agree. And point number 5 is industrial areas. The presence of industrial zones can affect the aesthetic and air quality. I would say this is true, especially for areas that are just past the Northeast, the areas like Dover, Erin Woods, Ogden. Those are technically Southeast neighborhoods, but people lump them into the Northeast. Those areas feel very industrial. You got trains running through and warehouses and stuff like that. So they're not the nicest residential neighborhoods. But for the most part, the areas of the Northeast, all the industrial areas are kind of closer to like the Deerfoot Trail. And then the residential is east of there. So that for the most part, it's not all industrial, but there are some pockets. And point number 6, lack of green spaces. So some neighborhoods may have fewer parks and recreational areas. I would say this is true. There are still lots of parks in the Northeast. They're just not quite as epic as other parts of Calgary. There are awesome parks in Calgary. You've got Nose Hill Park, Bowness Park. You've got all the parks along the Bow River and the Elbow Rivers. The river doesn't connect anywhere in Northeast Calgary, so it runs from northwest into the inner city and then down south where it connects to the Elbow River. And there's parkland all along the river, but in the Northeast it's just kind of flat prairie. There's no river. The views aren't quite the same. The parks aren't quite as good. But there are still lots of parks, specifically on the eastern edge of the Northeast along the Ring Road. There's a huge park that runs the length of it. So there are parks, they're just not as nice as other parts of the city. And point number 7 is the weather. The area can experience harsh weather conditions, including strong winds and heavy snowfall. They didn't mention hailstorms, which is very common in Northeast Calgary. I would say from the Northeast, kind of towards Airdrie and then to Red Deer, for whatever reason, that area gets hit by hailstorms more than any parts of Alberta, it seems like. So I agree with this. I think Northeast Calgary gets hit harder with hail than other parts of the city. And I have sold properties in the Northeast in Skyview Ranch that were shredded by hail before the buyer took possession. Like the home, it needed like $30,000 worth of siding repairs. So it's definitely a major issue in Calgary. And point number 8, diversity in schools. Some parents express concerns about the varying quality of education in local schools. You'll find that complaint anywhere in the world, so I'm not going to touch on that. The schools in the Northeast they're as good as any other part of Calgary. Number 9 is property values. Fluctuating real estate values can be a concern for homeowners. Welcome to Calgary. It's a boom and bust economy. The Northeast is not singled out. This is the same for all over Calgary. We have boom markets, we have bust markets. That's just the way that Calgary is, and it's not specific to the Northeast. Point number 10 is shopping and amenities. This one I don't agree with. So it says limited high-end shopping and dining options compared to other parts of the city. So Northeast Calgary has tons of shopping. So that I don't agree with that point. High-end dining options, yeah, I could probably agree with that. Most of the high-end dining options are located in the city center, not so much in the suburbs. But there's lots of like blue-collar dining options, like mom and pop shops throughout the Northeast. So there is still excellent dining in the Northeast. It might not be as fancy as in the inner city, but it's still quite good. And point number 11 is the aesthetic appeal. Some areas may lack the visual appeal found in other neighborhoods. This is true. There are exceptions to this because some people really take care of their properties in the Northeast, but a lot of people don't. They don't mow their lawn, they don't manicure it, they don't landscape it. But again, there are exceptions. But overall, if you drive around the west end of Calgary versus the Northeast, it looks radically different. People just take care of their lawns and their homes much more in other parts of the city compared to the Northeast. And point number 12 is cultural differences. Diversity can sometimes lead to cultural clashes or misunderstandings. I'd say that's right, just because the Northeast is so diverse, not everyone gets along with each other. But for the most part, I think Calgary is a very peaceful city, and I think for the most part, people get along with each other. But again, people are people, and there's differences, and Calgary is no different than anywhere else in the world. And point number 13 is homelessness. Visible homelessness can be a concern in some areas. I would say that most of the homeless in Calgary are living in the downtown inner city area, but there are some in the Northeast, but not that many. Like usually they're around gas stations and stuff like that. They're asking for money, but there's not a huge amount in the Northeast from what I've seen. And point number 14 is infrastructure. Older infrastructure in some neighborhoods may require updates. The Northeast isn't an old part of Calgary. I think the oldest homes that you see there are like the late 70s into the 80s. So there are older parts of the city. So this one, I'm not sure if I totally agree. Infrastructure is always a problem in Calgary all over the city as we keep expanding and growing. So it's not a specific Northeast problem. And point number 15 is the pollution. Proximity to industrial areas can lead to concerns about air noise and pollution. Again, those areas I mentioned earlier, like Ogden, Dover, Erin Woods, I would agree with that. Those are very industrial type areas, but that's a very specific part of that area. Most of the Northeast, I would say, is away from heavy industry and stuff like that. So I partially agree on this point. Not a huge concern, I would say. Point number 16 are social services. The perception that social services and community programs are not as robust. I'm not too sure about this one, so I'm going to pass on this one. I can't really comment on that. I've never really gotten involved in social services. Point number 17, public perception. Northeast Calgary sometimes suffers from a negative reputation. That's why I made this video in the thumbnail, anywhere but Northeast Calgary. It's a bit of a clickbait type of thumbnail, but it does suffer from a negative reputation, but it's not all warranted, as I discussed earlier. And point number 18 is nightlife. Fewer nightlife options compared to the city center. This is true for all of the suburbs. The inner city of Calgary is the most lively part of the city, and the suburbs aren't as lively. That's the same in the Northwest, the Southwest, the Southeast. So the Northeast is not singled out here on that point. Point number 19, job opportunities. Perceived lack of high-paying job opportunities within the immediate area. This I don't agree with. Like I mentioned earlier, most of the office buildings, industrial, warehouse outside the downtown is located in the Northeast. So I think there's a lot of jobs here. And especially around the airport. If you drive around the perimeter of the airport, there's all sorts of big buildings and factories and stuff like that support the airport. So I think there's a lot of jobs that are located in the Northeast. I don't agree with this point. And point number 20, the housing quality. Some areas may have older housing stock that requires more maintenance. This one I don't know if I agree with. The oldest part of Calgary is the inner city, and Northeast Calgary is like from the late 70s and up. So it's not terribly old. Some properties need renovations, but every other part of Calgary does as well. So it's not a specific Northeast problem. So this one I'm not sure if I agree with. And 2 points here. So one point that I forgot to mention, when we're talking about parks and stuff like that, there is a neighborhood called Coral Springs. It's a lake community in the Northeast. So it has a beautiful lake and nice walking paths. So there are some nice parkland areas in the Northeast. All right, we're done here. Now, if you are moving to Calgary and you're thinking about the Northeast or anywhere else in the city, feel free to give me a call, shoot me a text, or send me an email. I'm easy to get a hold of, and I'd love to help you out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.